Let's talk about shin splints. Shin splints is something that we're seeing far too often these days as running gets more popular. It's not just your running load that brings on shin splints. There's a multitude of underlying factors that can contribute to your symptoms and why your symptoms aren't going away. So let's get into it and talk about what you can do in order to help you reduce your shin splints and get back to running perfectly again. So what is shin splints? Shin splints is actually bone-based stress. So it's referred to as medial tibial stress syndrome. It's when your bone isn't turning over well enough to keep up with the demands of the sport. So if you brought in too much load, whether that's volume or if you brought in too much intensity, so pace, your body isn't keeping up with the demands because it's not used to it, then your bone starts to change its ratio of turnover and it starts to get stressed. So that could be either swelling on the outside of your bone or on the inside of your bone. And progressively, if you don't manage that well, it can start a formation of a fracture line. So shin splints is actually a progressive injury to eventually it being a stress fracture. So it's really, really important when we're dealing with shin splints, knowing that early management is crucial. Because if you don't manage that well, you end up in a zone where you've got a stress fracture, and that's going to be extended periods away from running, which is not fun for anyone. Another factor to consider when we're dealing with shin splints is fueling. Are you fueling appropriately? What we see a lot of in clinic is unintentional underfueling. You might feel full, you might feel satiated, but your body actually needs more fuel for the increase in running that you've just taken on. If you're not increasing your fueling, your body doesn't have the energy it requires in order to turn over good, healthy bone, and then you start to go into a stress response. We've spoken about training load and we've spoken about fueling. Let's talk about strength training. Research will show us that strength training is one of the best ways of building bone mineral density. So if you're not adding in regular strength and conditioning sessions, 1 to 2 sessions a week, that's going to be a factor when dealing with your bones not being as strong enough to withstand the load of your running. And finally, let's talk about the most important thing when dealing with shin splints, something that doesn't get spoken of enough, and that is a menstrual cycle. So if you've got an absence of your menstrual cycle or a lack of menstrual cycle, this could be either with not getting consistent cycles or the flow not being consistent from cycle to cycle. That actually has a direct impact on your bone health. So when you go through your menstrual cycle, your body produces the adequate amount of estrogen, which is a key hormone in the ticking over of good, healthy bone. So it's important to speak to a health professional, either your GP, a sports medicine consultant, to understand how you can get yourself back into a good, healthy menstrual space, because this will have a huge impact in your recovery when dealing with shin splints. Let's talk about pain and shin splints. When it comes to shin splints, pain is not directly correlated to damage, and this could be because of how pain manifests within the injury. You could get pain in 2 separate ways. You could get pain developing first within the bone marrow. There's no pain receptors in your bone marrow, so you don't feel too much until it's further down the track. And you can have pain developing on the outside of your bone within your periosteum, which is really pain sensitive, which might seem and give you the illusion that things are further down the track, but reality might be just a low level stress response. So how do you determine if you have an injury that is further down the track or a little bit earlier on? This comes down to the size of pain location on your actual shin itself. So if your pain is greater than 5 centimeters, typically the research will show us that that means it's more likely to be a stress response on a lower grade than it is to be a stress fracture. As that pain zone starts to reduce now to 3 centimeters and lower and become a bit more point specific, research will show us that this means it's more likely to be a higher grade stress response or potential stress fracture. So you can have a mapping out of your pain on your shin, have a poke and a probe gently to understand what that exact area is like and determine where you might potentially be. The important thing though, dealing with shin splints, is to remember that if you don't treat, manage and respect it, it can develop into a stress fracture. So it does need a high level of care regardless of where you are in the grading spectrum. When we're dealing with shin splints, there's 2 tests that you can do functionally to determine if you have shin splints. The first is a nice simple calf raise, single leg calf raise. Can you perform it perfectly with good technique, good control and symptom free? If you have symptoms during a calf raise, that might give us some information that your shin splints are quite irritable and you'll need to take some considerable time off running depending on the severity of the injury. The next thing is a single leg hop. Running is a series of single leg hops. So your inability to do hopping for 30 seconds on one side will give us a lot of information as to when you might be ready to run again. And then most importantly, make sure you see someone about shin splints. It's very different to a muscle-based injury that you could probably self-manage quite easily. Shin splints requires a team-based approach. See a sports medicine consultant, a physiotherapist, or a health professional in your home country. You might need to see a sports nutritionist as well in order to get a really nice multifactorial team around you to help address all the little factors at play.